Does handwriting still have a place in modern Chinese learning? Let's explore 8 more popular arguments in favor of writing characters by hand to see if they hold up to scrutiny. Hello and welcome to the Hacking Chinese podcast. In this week's episode, we are going to continue the discussion about writing Chinese characters by hand, which we started in episode 256. Naturally, I've discussed handwriting many times on the podcast before, but this is part 2 in a mini-series about arguments in favor of writing Chinese characters by hand. So what I've done here is to collect arguments that I've heard or read about why it's good to write Chinese characters by hand. These arguments are usually brought forth to counter-arguments in favor of limiting the amount of characters that students need to write by hand. For a more thorough explanation of the handwriting debate, please refer to the first part, which was, as I said, episode 256. In that episode, we discussed 8 reasons to write Chinese characters by hand, sorted into 2 sections, and the first one was about practical considerations and functional use cases, so essentially arguing that learning to write by hand is necessary, or at least necessary in certain situations. Section 2 then covered arguments grounded in learning efficiency and memory, essentially saying that learning to write characters by hand can enhance your Chinese in other ways, such as deepening your knowledge about characters, which could then be useful for reading, for example. In this episode then, we're going to cover another 8 arguments, and they are also sorted into 2 sections. Section 3 is about cultural and personal arguments, and then section 4 is about handwriting as a cognitive tool and emotional experience. Before we dive into section 3 though, I'd like to mention 2 things. First is that I did receive a lot of feedback on the previous article, and I think I covered most of the arguments, but there are 2 that I want to bring up here briefly. The first argument is that it's useful to know how to write by hand even if you learn and use Chinese mostly in a digital context, because, for example, when you want to look something up using a digital dictionary with handwriting input, that requires you to have decent stroke order for characters to show up. This argument is true, but it's not as strong as it used to be. I remember what it was like when I got my first device that supported handwriting input, and this was a game changer because suddenly I can look up characters in a book, maybe my textbook, maybe something else I'm reading, without having to figure out which part is the radical and how many strokes does the other part have, and so on. I could just write them on the screen, and most of the time the dictionary found the correct character. That, however, required you to know stroke order, because if you got the stroke order wrong, the dictionary simply wouldn't work. In other words, the dictionary did not do a visual comparison between the finished character and all the characters it had in memory and then try to find the best match, but instead it also relied on how you wrote the strokes, in what order, and so on. This is still true to a certain extent. It's much easier to use handwriting input in an app such as Pleco if you have correct stroke order, but it's not necessary. I just tried with several characters and I wrote them in deliberately very weird forms, like joining strokes that shouldn't be joined and mixing up the order, and most of the time you can still find the right character. This is not the main reason I think this is a weak argument though. Instead, it's that we rarely need to use handwriting input at all these days. If you read something, it's likely to be digital, and then you can just copy-paste or use a pop-up dictionary. There is no need to write anything by hand on a screen. Naturally, sometimes we do encounter characters in real life, maybe on a menu, or maybe it's a sign somewhere or something like that. And then you can just point your phone at it and see what it means, or you can use the OCR function in most modern dictionary apps. And you don't need to write by hand then either. It just takes a picture and it tells you what the characters mean, and you can even click on them to get the dictionary definitions. So yes, knowing stroke order makes it easier to look up characters you find in MeetSpace, but that doesn't mean it's worth the hundreds or thousands of hours to learn handwriting just to reap that small benefit in a small number of situations. The second argument that I didn't cover and honestly didn't think about is that if you don't have access to digital devices, you have no choice. This is true. If you don't have a smartphone or a computer, you can't type, and so if you want to write, the only option is to do so by hand. In a way, I think this is obvious, but it also applies to very few people who are listening to this episode or reading my article, because then you need a digital device, and most people who learn Chinese are doing so digitally anyway, and so arguing that you should learn handwriting as a fallback just in case you don't have a digital device is a little bit far-fetched in my opinion. Then again, if you're learning Chinese without stable access to electricity or the internet, then you have to write by hand. But like I said, this is kind of obvious. If you are in this situation, you don't really need this debate because there you have no choice. Okay, so one more thing I want to mention before we dive into section 3 is that I've added a lot of further reading to the article on hacking Chinese. So if you want to read what other thoughtful people have said about this debate, you can check out the references there. However, after reading what I can find about handwriting, I still haven't been able to find good arguments that I haven't already covered either in the previous episode or that we will cover in this one. So let's dive into section 3, cultural and personal arguments. So I'll read through the arguments and then we will talk about them one by one. Chinese characters are a core part of Chinese culture. You can't say that you've mastered Chinese if you can't write by hand. If you don't learn to write characters, you don't know what it's like. People don't study Chinese properly these days. We used to write by hand at school. Being able to write characters by hand is a great way to impress native speakers. Or alternatively, not being able to write by hand can be very embarrassing. Let's take a look at each of these arguments and see how they hold up. The first one is Chinese characters are a core part of Chinese culture. This is a common argument, and I think the reason is that when we suggest that you shouldn't write as much by hand or that you should only write a core set of characters, people feel threatened sometimes because they feel that characters are an integral part of Chinese culture, and if we don't teach characters, we lose something important. The problem here is that nobody really is suggesting that we throw characters away entirely. We're just saying that we shouldn't require students to learn to write by hand anything that they can say, for example. And this means that we can still learn characters. We can write characters, we can learn to read them, we can appreciate Chinese culture, calligraphy, and so on. All these things are perfectly possible without requiring students to write everything by hand. So yes, it's true that Chinese characters are an integral part of Chinese culture, and that's great. But this does not automatically mean that students should learn to write everything by hand. The next argument is that you can't say that you've mastered Chinese if you can't write by hand. This is also an argument I've heard many times, usually by native speakers when they realize that there are foreigners who cut down on handwriting quite a lot, or some even skip it entirely. The validity of this argument depends on your definition of mastered and if mastered is indeed something you are striving for. I think it's completely reasonable to say that if you mastered something, you should know all the different aspects of it, not just some of them that happen to be convenient. So for example, we could say that we have pronunciation, handwriting, grammar, vocabulary, listening, and so on. And if you've skipped one of these components, handwriting in this case, I think it's not unfair to say that, well, you haven't mastered Chinese, at least not the writing system, because you don't have that one component. This is a little bit similar to some of the arguments in section 1, because it's about who decides why you are learning Chinese or what your goal for learning Chinese is. If you set your own goals and you have your own agenda, then it doesn't really matter if a random native speaker thinks that you haven't mastered Chinese. Why do you care? But if this is something you do care about, we should maybe take this argument a little bit more seriously. And I will get back to this in a separate argument later too. Next up, we have, if you don't learn to write characters, you don't know what it's like. Native speakers spend an enormous amount of time learning Chinese characters in school, far more than we spend learning our own native languages, and this is not strange considering that there are more characters to learn and just a more complex writing system in general. So the idea here is that if you don't learn to write characters by hand a lot, you will not know what it's like to do so. So it's about cultural understanding. And I think this argument is hard to argue against. I do think that I have more appreciation for what it's like to learn characters for native speakers, simply because I've learned to handwrite 5,000 plus characters myself. The problem here is not so much that the argument isn't valid, it's that it's not about characters themselves. This is about cultural understanding. And if that's what you're after, I think you're simply better off listening to native speakers talking about their educational experience, how they wrote characters or learned characters when they grew up, or maybe reading about it, watching TV series and movies, etc. Sure, spending hundreds or thousands of hours writing characters yourself will probably make you understand what it's like more than just reading about it secondhand, as it were, but is it worth all that time just for that insight? Well, probably not for most students. Moving on, we have people don't study Chinese properly these days. We used to write by hand at school. This argument is so weak that I considered skipping it at first, but it is pretty common, so I wanted to mention it anyway. This is basically just appeal to tradition without any kind of argument beyond that. It's a little bit like saying, we used to starve, so therefore you should starve too, or when I went to school, I was bullied, so therefore you should be bullied. Naturally, I'm not implying that learning characters in itself is as bad as starving or being bullied, of course. I'm just saying that tradition itself, or that something being tradition, is not an argument. Of course, there might be a reason it is a tradition, but then we can examine these reasons, not the fact that it happens to be something somebody used to do and now people are not doing it anymore. So in essence, this seems to be more a lamentation of the fact that digital technology has largely replaced handwriting, and that is a perfectly valid opinion, but I don't think it is an argument in favor of forcing all the students to write characters by hand just because you did when you went to school. I also dislike this argument because there seems to be a lot of judgment in it as well. When you say that somebody isn't doing something properly, you indicate that they are lazy, maybe stupid, decadent, foolish, and so on, because they obviously don't do it the right way, whereas they might have good reasons for doing it exactly the way that they are doing it. We learn Chinese for different reasons, we have different goals, and so how we learn will also be different. Next up, we have being able to write Chinese characters by hand is a great way to impress native speakers, or the reverse of that, not being able to write by hand can be very embarrassing. I mentioned this earlier when we talked about mastering Chinese, and if you include handwriting in mastering, well, it can be a little bit awkward. Maybe people will think that you haven't mastered Chinese if you can't write by hand. Even though this argument is superficial and might seem a bit odd to some of you, I don't think we should dismiss it outright, because sometimes what other people think about you can be important. This is a little bit similar to having a foreign accent when speaking a language. There are many sensible people who claim that it's perfectly fine to have an accent when you speak any language. It doesn't really matter as long as people can understand you. But then again, there are people who aren't so sensible, and people judge books by their covers all the time, even though we are told not to. This is similar to handwriting in the sense that people might judge your other abilities less if they figure out you can't write by hand or have a very limited ability to do so. For example, your written Chinese in general might be awesome, but if you can't write by hand and somebody notices this, they might assume that your Chinese is much worse than it actually is. We talked about a specific instance of this in the previous episode in this series, when I said that if the person who admits you to something or is the one who's deciding if you get this job or not cares about handwriting and you can't write by hand, then that will be a problem, even if this is unreasonable. Additionally, some people feel uneasy not being able to write by hand. I mean, it is kind of embarrassing when your Chinese is rather advanced and somebody asks you if you can write this out for them and you can't. I don't think this is a strong reason to learn to write everything by hand, but for some people it is at least a reason. So to conclude section 3 about cultural and personal arguments, I think it's about what situation you're learning Chinese in, what you think yourself, and what you think might be relevant for you. None of these arguments really call for writing everything by hand, but again, it can help to write a subset of characters and learn to write some Chinese characters by hand. This brings us to section 4, handwriting as a cognitive tool and emotional experience. The first argument is, writing characters is good mental exercise, gymnastics for your brain. Even if I have studied some psychology at university, I'm not a cognitive scientist, but if it's one thing I've learned about reading about these types of questions, is that transfer is very limited. You can't just learn Chinese characters and expect that to make you good at other mental activities. This is why brain games and the like are not very useful, but of course it can be argued that learning a language is useful, and handwriting is part of that. Learning and using a foreign language can have certain cognitive benefits, but this is not limited to handwriting specifically. And yes, while you challenge your memory extra when you try to recall how to write characters, you can challenge your memory in many other ways, and you do that constantly when you learn Chinese. And so handwriting as some type of mental gymnastics just because it's good for you, I think is not a valid argument. Next up, we have I like writing Chinese characters, it feels good or looks cool. This is a common argument, and it's as if people think that when I say that you probably don't need to write everything by hand, I'm trying to take away something that they love, and this is obviously bad. Note that I've never tried to stop people from writing characters if they like doing so. I'm simply saying that if you don't like writing characters and learning efficiency and progressing in the language is your main goal, then spending more than half of your learning time on handwriting is not a good idea. It is true that many students start learning Chinese because they think Chinese characters are beautiful or appealing in some other way, and I was such a student, so I can definitely empathize with this, but this doesn't mean that we should force everybody to do this just because you think it's aesthetically pleasing or cool or something else. I'm not going to tell you to stop writing characters if you love doing so. I mean, if you like apples, then eat apples. If you like action movies, then go to the cinema and watch one. If you like writing characters, well, write characters. This means we have arrived at the last argument, which is writing characters is meditative and relaxing. This is very similar to the argument about characters being cool or aesthetically pleasing, in that it is highly individual. Yes, some people find character writing by hand to be meditative, and if you're one of these people and you want a meditative experience, well, then it's great. But there are also many students who find handwriting tedious and boring, and then forcing them to write everything by hand just because you like it seems a little bit odd to me. So again, if you feel that handwriting is good for you in some way, I'm not going to tell you to stop. I'm just saying that we shouldn't force this on everybody. To each their own. It's time to wrap up this episode and also this series. We have now looked at 16 arguments for writing characters by hand in Chinese, or technically it's 18 if we include the 2 extra ones I added to this episode. I think many of the arguments make sense, and that there are indeed benefits of writing characters by hand. And I want to point that out very clearly, that the idea here is not to say that handwriting has 0 benefits. I think I've never heard anybody claim that. Instead, the reason that I and many other educators recommend limiting the number of characters students have to write by hand is because of opportunity cost. Learning to write by hand everything you can type and say is very time-consuming. As I've mentioned a few times, we're talking about hundreds or even thousands of hours. And if you had invested that time into something else, say listening or reading or having conversations, or basically any other communicative activity, your Chinese would improve so much faster. And as I mentioned in the previous episode, if you're worried about not learning enough about the writing system, nothing stops you from taking some of the time you saved and invest that into studying the writing system directly, learning more about characters, functional components, the origin of characters, and so on. Many of the other arguments I've brought up here are highly subjective, and that was most of the arguments we talked about today, where some people will think it's a very strong argument and other people will not. For example, if you think that writing Chinese characters by hand feels good or meditative, well, then you should of course do that if you think it's nice. But that doesn't mean that everybody agrees. Some people find writing characters by hand to be extremely tedious and boring. And this is what I mean when I say that some arguments are highly individual. One final thing I want to say before wrapping up this episode is that handwriting in Chinese is not a simple either-or question. When I say that we should limit the number of characters we require students to be able to write by hand, I'm not saying that we should skip handwriting entirely, and I'm definitely not saying that we should skip the written language entirely. Still, when reading responses to proposals about limiting the amount of characters we write by hand in schools, for example, many people still seem to think that the argument is that either we write everything by hand, or we do nothing and we only use computers all the time. This is a straw man argument. It's simpler to attack someone who says we should skip handwriting entirely, because that obviously has some clear downsides, than it is to engage in a debate about the arguments for writing Chinese characters by hand, as I've done in these 2 episodes. So what I'm saying here is that the debate should not be about whether or not we write Chinese characters by hand, or if we're teachers, if we ask our students to do so or require them to be able to write characters by hand. Instead, it's about how many characters they should learn to write by hand, and when, and which characters. The answers to these questions are not easy, but I'm sure we can learn more about this over time, at least if we stop thinking about this as an either-or debate. This brings us to the end of this episode, and maybe we will return to this topic later, trying to answer some of the questions I posed there at the end, but for now I think this covers all the important arguments that I've heard in favor of handwriting. Naturally, if you think I've missed something, feel free to leave a comment on Hacking Chinese. Or if you have opinions or feedback or comments on some of the arguments we have discussed, do let me know. Thank you for tuning in to the Hacking Chinese podcast. If you like this episode, please share it. More information and inspiration about learning and teaching Chinese can be found at hackingchinese.com. See you in the next episode, and until then, good luck with your studies.